This video is about a case study, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's a big dam that Ethiopia is constructing near the border with the Sudan on the Nile. And as we speak, in February 2020, the relevant states are actually getting together to discuss ways forward in relation to this dam. So it's a very topical issue at the moment. So let me introduce the issue to you. Most of the people in Egypt live, as we all know, near the Nile and are highly dependent on it. It is their lifeline. And if we think of Egypt or history, Egyptian history or Egyptian stories, they always relate to the Nile. So Egypt basically uses the Nile for everything, for drinking water, for navigation, for energy. So they constructed a big dam, the Aswan Dam, to draw energy from the Nile. But also they use it for irrigation, to irrigate their crops, to make food. And they use it, very importantly, for tourism. So a lot of tourists, they are provided with trips along the Nile. So everything that happens in Egypt has some kind of relationship with this river, with the Nile. So it's of immense importance to the country. Egypt gets most of the water, so most of the water in the Nile originates in Ethiopia. About 60–70% of the water in Egyptian Nile originates in Ethiopia. So here you see some pictures to show the importance of the Nile for Egypt. So on the left you see a picture taken from the skies. Basically Egypt is a huge desert except for the banks of the Nile. Only along the banks of the Nile you find fertile ground, so ground that is suitable to grow crops and basically suitable to live. So on the picture to the right you see the population density in Egypt. So the darker red the color, the more people live there. And as you'll see, basically everybody in Egypt lives on the banks of the Nile. So to recap, Ethiopia, as the upstream state, provides more than 80% of the water in the Nile, but Ethiopia uses less than 1%. I'll get back to that later. Egypt and the Sudan provide nothing, so to speak, but they are entirely dependent on the Nile for everything. And their reliance on the Nile has only become more urgent in recent times due to a limited amount of water available. That was always a problem. But also due to population growth. Everybody in Egypt takes to the cities. They all move to Cairo, Luxor, and so on. And to the Nile Delta up north. Due to climate change, Egypt has always been a very dry country, but due to climate change, it's even more dry than it used to be. And also the Nile itself begins to suffer from the consequences of climate change. And environmental degradation. So the Nile increasingly is facing challenges relating to pollution. In 2011, Ethiopia began the construction of a huge dam on the Nile, very close to the border between Ethiopia and the Sudan. But obviously the dam is situated on Ethiopian territory, because you cannot authorize the construction of such a huge dam on another state's territory. So it's situated on Ethiopian territory. But this dam, it already has huge consequences for the Nile, for the flow of the water into the downstream states, Sudan and Egypt. And these consequences will only become more drastic. Why is that? Because to operate this dam, Ethiopia needs to fill a gigantic artificial lake with water. And the filling of this lake, and this lake is huge, it will be the biggest artificial lake in Africa, maybe even in the world. To fill this lake with water will take, well, depending on how quickly this is done, between 3 to 21 years. Of course, Ethiopia wants to fill the lake as quickly as possible, but that would mean drawing a lot of water from the Nile, which will have the consequence that very little water will be available to Sudan and Egypt, to the downstream states. So Egypt wants the filling of this reservoir to take as long as possible. So Egypt is even suggesting a 21-year period to fully fill the reservoir. Because then within this period there will be sufficient water available to the downstream states, to Sudan, but especially to Egypt. In the media, but especially in the Western media, the controversy relating to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is often a bit exaggerated. So a reference is made to war. And Egypt supposedly has threatened to send jet fighter planes to bomb the dam if Ethiopia refuses to take into consideration Egyptians' interest in water rights. So in the Western media you find a lot of headlines like water wars intensify between Egypt and Ethiopia, military strike apparent, and so on. You'll see them in the slide. But if you look at the local reporting, it's a bit more nuanced, even though, of course, I have to admit that in some local newspapers you do find rather aggressive language as well. But there's more nuanced reporting being done also in the local newspapers, and here I show you some examples. So if we translate this into legal language, Egypt fears that the construction of the dam, of this Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, will cause significant harm to its people, to its interests. So Egypt is relying on the obligation, which exists under international water law, of a upstream state not to cause significant harm to the downstream state. And Egypt makes the argument that this dam, especially if its reservoirs are filled too quickly, will have such negative impact on the downstream states, Sudan and specifically Egypt. Ethiopia, on the other hand, Ethiopia being the upstream state, believes that the dam will not significantly affect the flow of the river, of the water into the downstream states. And Ethiopia also insists on the advantages that the dam will have, also for the downstream states. So the dam, once built and once put into operation, may actually be able to control floods, the flooding of the Nile, which does happen occasionally. And you see that the Sudan, which initially was on the side of Egypt, is now sort of reconsidering its position, because they do see the added value of the dam in the sense that it might help prevent floods in the future, because it's especially Sudan that has suffered from overflooding of the Nile in the past. Also, the Nile will be a hydropower dam, so it will draw energy from the Nile. And this energy, this electricity, can be sold to the Sudan and to other neighboring states at reasonable prices. So that could also be a reason for Sudan to actually be more favorably inclined towards this construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So as I told you, as we speak, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan are negotiating on how quickly to fill the reservoirs of the dam, how much of the water should be allowed to flow into the downstream countries after the dam is put into operation. And what they also discuss is what to do in case of drought. So what special measures should Ethiopia take in case of droughts. And basically every year there is a dry season. In this time of the year, the Sudan and Egypt may need a bit more water to come their way. So there's this discussion going on. But to what extent and in what way Ethiopia should keep this into consideration and should adapt its policies in relation to the operation of the dam. If we look at the applicable international law that has a bearing on the Nile and on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, we have to go back to colonial history. Interestingly, Egypt and Sudan, they were both at some point colonies of the United Kingdom. Egypt only gained its independence in 1922, but that was partial independence, and its full independence it gained in 1952. And the Sudan became fully independent in 1956. So it's important to keep this in mind when I discuss the treaties in a minute. Ethiopia, interestingly, was never colonized, but some people argue that it was occupied by Italy in the period 1935 to 1940. Some scholars even refer to that as a 5-year period of colonialism, but I think occupation, if any term would be apt, it would be occupation. So Ethiopia basically never colonized. And that explains why Ethiopia could conclude treaties with the United Kingdom in relation to the Nile. So here you see an overview of those agreements. So there's first a treaty of 1902 between Ethiopia on the one hand and the United Kingdom on the other. And it's important to keep in mind that at this time, 1902, the UK basically concluded treaties on behalf of Egypt and the Sudan, because those were at the time colonies of the United Kingdom. Then in 1929 there was an exchange of notes between the United Kingdom, which was then still governing the Sudan, and Egypt, which had then gained partial independence. So it could conclude treaties on its own. So this is an agreement between the United Kingdom and Egypt. Interestingly, Ethiopia is not a party. So no rights created for Ethiopia. Also no obligations. Then in 1959, so after the Sudan gained its independence in 1956, a treaty was concluded between Egypt, the United Arab Republic as it was then called, and the Republic of the Sudan. So that's the third agreement that is of relevance in the present case. And then we fast forward to present times, and in 2010 an agreement was made on the Nile River Basin Cooperative Frame, or creating a Nile River Basin Cooperative Framework. Importantly, very importantly, this framework needed a certain number of states to ratify it before its entry into force. So it needed 6 states to ratify it. And the framework has not reached that number yet, so it has not yet entered into force. But even if 6 states would be willing to ratify this agreement, it would still be of little consequence if these states do not include Egypt and the Sudan. And Egypt and Sudan have made it quite clear that they have no intention to ever become party to this cooperative framework of 2010. So Ethiopia has ratified it, but Egypt and the Sudan will probably never do so, which makes this cooperative framework basically a failure. Then in 2015, Ethiopia, the Sudan, and Egypt, so it's the first agreement which is literally made by the 3 relevant states, they agreed on a declaration of principles on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. They did so in 2015. But the problem with this declaration is that it's not a treaty, so it's not legally binding. It just could be seen as an intention, a first intention of the states to get together and to sort of agree on a framework to limit it or to give shape to the negotiations. And these negotiations, they are ongoing until the present day. As I told you, today, we are now at February of the year 2020. Today, those three states are negotiating on the basis of those principles that they agreed upon in 2015. So let's look a bit more closely at these agreements, beginning with the 1902 agreement between Ethiopia and the United Kingdom. So in this 1902 agreement, I will read the relevant paragraph. The two states, Ethiopia and the UK, on behalf of Egypt and Sudan, they agreed to the following. So Ethiopia engages itself towards the UK not to construct or allow to be constructed any work across the Blue Nile, which would arrest the flow of its waters into the Nile, except in agreement with the UK. And so basically, what does this mean? It means that Ethiopia cannot construct a dam, even on Ethiopian territory, without the consent of the UK. And you could consider the Sudan and Egypt as successor states to the UK. And so in that sense, this could be read as an obligation of Ethiopia to seek the permission of Egypt and the Sudan before constructing something as grand as the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Then in 1929, an exchange of notes was agreed upon between the United Kingdom and Egypt, very briefly after the latter gained at least partial independence. So this is an agreement between UK, acting on behalf of Sudan, and Egypt. It did not, and that's really important to realize, it did not involve Ethiopia. Ethiopia was not a party to this exchange of notes. So what do we find in this exchange of notes? There it is realized that the development of the Sudan requires a quantity of the Nile water greater than that which has been so far utilized by the Sudan. As Your Excellency is aware, the Egyptian government has always been anxious to encourage such development and will therefore continue that policy and be willing to agree with His Majesty's government upon such an increase of this quantity as does not infringe Egypt's natural and historical rights in the waters of the Nile and its requirements of agricultural extension, subject to satisfactory assurances as to the safeguarding of Egyptian interests as detailed in later paragraphs of this note. And the most important of these later paragraphs I will read to you now, it's paragraph 2. It says, safe with the previous agreement of the Egyptian government, no irrigation or power works or measures are to be constructed or taken on the river Nile and its branches, or on the lakes from which it flows, so far as all these are in the Sudan or in countries under British administration, which would in such a manner as to entail any prejudice to the interests of Egypt, either reduce the quantity of water arriving in Egypt, or modify the date of its arrival, or lower its level. So again, it's a bit comparable to the 1902 agreement. Basically, the Sudan cannot construct any dams or other works on the Nile, which would have a negative effect on the flow of the water into the downstream state, into Egypt, save with the agreement of the Egyptian government. Interestingly, this agreement does not involve Ethiopia. Ethiopia was not even a party to this exchange of notes. Then the 1959 agreement, 1959, so concluded after Sudan gained its full independence. It's an agreement between Egypt and the Sudan, basically affirming this type of arrangement. Basically, Sudan and Egypt agree that any works on the Nile in Sudan require the consent of the downstream state, Egypt. And also they agree upon sort of division of the flow of water and the use of water. So the amount of water that Sudan can draw from the Nile for irrigation, and the amount of water that it should leave for the downstream state, Egypt. Then we get to more recent times. So in 2010, 4 of the Nile riparians, so Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda, they signed this cooperative framework agreement in Entebbe in Uganda. And they were joined 5 days later by Kenya and by Burundi in 2011. So then those states, they signed this agreement. But they did not all ratify it. But in any case, the purpose of this agreement was to replace those older treaties of 1929 and 1959. The Cooperative Framework Agreement has thus far only been ratified by Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Rwanda. So that's 3 states. But it needs 6 states to enter into force. So some of those states that signed initially in 2010 or in 2011, they have not yet ratified it. But more importantly is that Egypt and the Sudan, they were never favorably disposed towards this cooperative framework agreement. And that makes it of practical relevance, even if the amount of ratifications would have been reached for it to enter into force. Then we have the Declaration of Principles on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This is the first agreement which is signed by all 3 states, so both Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, the first time. But this is a legally non-binding declaration. It only sort of could be seen as a first step, a preliminary agreement, setting a sort of framework that can be later solidified in an actual agreement on relating to the use of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So if we now look at sustainable development in these instruments, because that is sort of the theme of my lectures. And so what do these agreements, what do they say about sustainable development of the Nile, sustainable use of the Nile? And then you find that especially the Cooperative Framework Agreement makes a lot of references to the concept of sustainable development. And so in its preamble, it features 3 times, as you can see on the slide. And more importantly, one of the main principles is the principle of sustainable development. And so states undertake to develop or to use the Nile in such a way that is compatible with the concept of sustainable development. And so that's all very promising. But of course, I have to admit and acknowledge and fully accept that the Cooperative Framework Agreement has not yet entered into force. If we then look at the Declaration of Principles, the Renaissance Dam, there you also find references to sustainability, primarily to sustainable energy. The main purpose of this Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is to draw energy from the Nile. And this energy, this electricity, can then be used to give a boost to Ethiopian economy, but it can also be sold to other states, especially to the Sudan. The Sudan has already expressed an interest in this electricity, and it's green electricity. So in our efforts to combat climate change, this is a very favorable development. So that is why the Declaration of Principles relating to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam makes reference to sustainable energy. So as we speak, it's now February 2020, the states are negotiating. They're actually negotiating today. And let's hope that they reach some kind of lasting solution on the basis of mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Territorial integrity meaning that they are all boss of their own territory. So Ethiopia decides what happens on its territory, Sudan decides what happens on Sudanese territory, and Egypt decides what happens on Egyptian territory. But also with respect for sovereign equality of all states. So maybe one state is politically or economically more powerful than the other, but in law, all states are sovereign and equal. Let's hope they also take into consideration the prohibition to use military force. So they should be urged to find a peaceful solution and also to settle this dispute peacefully without resorting to force and without threatening to use force. And they should reach a peaceful solution on the basis of the principle of non-interference in other states' internal affairs. So only to the extent that the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is an international affair with transboundary consequences, should this be a concern of the other states. All other aspects that relate solely to the development of the Ethiopian economy should be left for Ethiopia to decide, keeping in mind the right to self-determination of peoples, the principle of sovereign equality, and so on.